My name is Nora Vasson, and I am 34 years old, and I have never had a breakdown. I want to say that clearly before anything else, because the record on that point has been confused for long enough. It was a Friday in October when they walked me out, 2:17 in the afternoon, I know the time, because I looked at the clock above the reception desk as we passed it. The same clock I had looked at for 9 years, and I understood in that one moment that I might never look at it again. The security guard's name was Tom. I had once brought his daughter a book on civil engineering because she said she wanted to build bridges. That afternoon, he held the glass door open with one hand and looked somewhere past my left shoulder, and I understood that someone had told him something about me that made it difficult to look at my face. I was carrying a box. It held a coffee mug, a photograph of my daughter Marin at age 4, standing in a field with her arms out, and a small ceramic model of the falling water house that had sat on my desk since my first week at the firm. I had placed it there as a reminder of what good architecture requires, of what it costs to build something that actually lasts. Nobody from my team came to say goodbye. The letter from HR had arrived by email at 9 that morning. I read it at my desk with my coffee still warm. I read it twice. Then a third time, the way you read something that cannot possibly say what it says. The language was careful and measured. It referred to a formal wellness concern raised by a colleague it cited. Reported incidents of distressing and erratic behavior in the workplace environment. It recommended a period of paid administrative leave pending a review by the firm's employee assistance program. I sat with that for a long time I had not had any incidents. I had not behaved erratically. I had submitted the Whitmore proposal on Wednesday, on time and under budget. And the senior partner had stopped by my desk to say, "Well done." The day before, I had eaten lunch at my desk, as I did most Thursdays, and talked through load-bearing specifications with a junior associate. The previous Friday, I had attended a team meeting and said I think about 11 words. I called Declan. He didn't answer. I left a message that was calm and specific. I said there had been a situation at work and I needed to speak with him, and could he please call me? When he had a moment, I used the voice I reserve for difficult things. The voice Marin has never heard. "Break," he texted back 4 hours later. "Saw your message. Hope you're okay. Sounds stressful. I need to take you back. Not far. Only 4 years. But I need you to understand what the marriage looked like before it looked like this. Declan Vasson is an architect the same as me. We met at a conference in Edinburgh when I was 26. He was presenting a paper on passive house design, and I was in the third row. He was precise and funny in equal measure. And afterward, we talked for 2 hours in a hotel bar about thermal mass, and somehow eventually about the poetry of Philip Larkin. I remember thinking, here is a man who builds things carefully and also feels them deeply. I was not wrong about either of those things. I was wrong about which things he applied them to. We married in 2019. Marin came the following year for a while, 2 years, perhaps a little more. We were the thing I had believed we could become. Then something shifted. I have spent a great deal of time since trying to name exactly when it started, and I have come to believe that it does not begin with a single moment. It begins with a pattern of small corrections. A comment about the way I told a story at dinner that not quite how it happened. Lova's suggestion that I was perhaps too close to a difficult project. Too invested a remark made once and then again. And then again that I seemed tired lately. That I seemed overwhelmed, that he was worried about me. Concern always framed as concern. I did not understand what was happening. I want to be honest about that. I read structural tolerances for a living. I am not naive about the places where weight accumulates about which joints will eventually give, but inside a marriage, inside the specific closeness of a person who knows your history and your voice and the way you look. When you are frightened, the damage is harder to see. It hides in the language of care. By the time Marin was 3, I had begun to believe had been quietly, carefully, and consistently guided to believe that I was not as steady as I had once been. That the pressure of the job and the early years of motherhood had changed something in me that I needed to be careful. That word careful, he used it often. I was standing in the car park of Galton and Reed with a box in my arms when my phone rang. It was my mother calling from Leeds. She said Declan had rung her that morning. He had said I had been having a hard time of it lately. She said it gently, with the careful gentleness of someone who has been prepared for the conversation before it starts. I looked at the ceramic falling water sitting in the box. Frank Lloyd Wright designed that house in 36 hours after his client called to say he was on his way to see the drawings. Wright had not yet started them. He sat down and built a masterpiece under pressure in the dark against a deadline that should have been impossible. I thought about the fact that Declan had already spoken to my mother this morning before he answered my call, before he knew what I would say. I put the box in the boot of my car. I sat in the driver's seat. October light on the tarmac. Tom still watching through the glass. I opened my notebook graph, ruled the kind I have used since architecture school, and I wrote the date at the top of a clean page, and below it I wrote 3 words. When did this start? Not a question, a project. Brief. The first thing I did when I got home was make tea. Not because I wanted it, but because it gave my hands something to do, while the rest of me tried to understand the shape of what had just happened. Marin was at Declan's parents' house. They watched her on Fridays while we both worked, and I had 2 hours before I needed to collect her. I sat at the kitchen table with the tea going cold in front of me, and I opened my notebook to the page I had started in the car park. When did this start? I thought about the wellness concern and the unnamed colleague who had raised it. I thought about the phrase erratic behavior and tried to attach it to any moment in the past several months that might from the outside have looked like that. I went back through the weeks, carefully the way you walk a building after a flood looking for the water line. I could not find a single incident that matched the description, which meant one of 2 things. Either I was so far inside a deterioration that I could no longer see it clearly, which was exactly what Declan had been suggesting with great gentleness for the past 2 years. Or someone had described something that had never happened. I wrote both possibilities down in my notebook. I drew a line between them. I sat with the line for a long time. The next morning I called Priya. Priya Nair had been my closest colleague at the firm for 6 years. We had worked the Hendricks project together, the one that won the regional award, and we had eaten lunch most Wednesdays, and she had come to the hospital when Marin was born and brought a pot of her mother's lentil soup and sat with me for 2 hours while Declan was on a call. She was the kind of friend you build slowly without noticing until one day you look up and realize the structure between you is load-bearing. She didn't answer. I tried twice more that day and once the following morning. The calls went to voicemail each time. I left one message. I said it was me and that I was fine and that I just wanted to talk. I kept my voice level. I did not say that I was frightened. On the 3rd day, she sent a text. It said she was really sorry and that things were a bit complicated right now and that she hoped I was taking care of myself. I read that message 4 times. Taking care of yourself is what people say when they have been told you are not capable of doing it. It is kind language that carries a very specific meaning underneath. I wrote the text down word for word in my notebook, and I underlined taking care of yourself, and I moved on. I had an appointment with my therapist that Thursday. Dr. Elaine Marsh had been seeing me for 3 years initially for the ordinary work of early motherhood and the particular exhaustion that comes with a demanding career and a young child. I had not found the sessions revelatory, but I had found them useful the way a level is useful, not because it tells you something you didn't know, but because it confirms what you suspected and gives you a number. I sat down across from her, and before I could speak, she asked me how I had been feeling in the weeks before the leave began. There was something careful in the way she asked it. Not her usual register. I told her I had been feeling fine. Busy, but fine. She nodded and made a note, and then she said there was something she needed to share with me and that she wanted me to hear it in the right way. 6 weeks earlier, she had received a letter. It was anonymous, and it had arrived by post to her professional address. It described me as a person who was struggling significantly and who had on several occasions expressed thoughts about harming herself. It said that the people close to me were concerned, but that I had refused all offers of support. It recommended that she consider escalating her level of care. I looked at her, and I said that none of that was true. She said she knew that. She said she had not acted on the letter in the way the letter had suggested because it did not match her clinical experience of me, and because anonymous correspondence is not a basis for clinical decisions. But she had made a note of it, and she had mentioned to my GP during a routine update that she had received a concerning communication and that she was monitoring the situation. My GP had passed that information to occupational health. Occupational Health had flagged it to the firm's employee assistance program. The wellness concern had not come from a colleague in my office. It had started with a letter sent to a therapist 6 weeks before I was walked out the door. I asked her if I could see the letter. She said she had it on file and that given the circumstances she felt I had a right to review it. It was 2 paragraphs long. The language was articulate and measured and concerned. It quoted something I had said to Declan in our kitchen on a Tuesday evening in August. I remembered the conversation. I had said I was exhausted and that some days the weight of everything made me want to simply disappear for a while. I had meant a holiday. I had meant 2 days somewhere quiet with no emails. The letter had taken that sentence and placed it inside a framework that made it sound like something else entirely. Only one person had heard me say those words. I drove home from that appointment slowly, and I sat outside the house for a while before going in. The evening light was flat and gray, and the neighbors across the road were bringing their bins in from the curb. Margaret from number 14 waved at me from her front step. Margaret was 71 and retired and had lived on the street for 30 years, and she had always been kind to Marin. I got out of the car and walked across and asked her how she was. She said she was well, and then she paused and said she hoped things were a little easier for me lately. She said Declan had popped round a few times recently and that he had seemed very worried. She said she had told him that she had noticed I seemed a bit low. I asked her when he had last come by. She thought about it and said the previous Wednesday. The Wednesday I had submitted the Whitmore proposal on time and under budget and received a compliment from the senior partner. I thanked her and said goodnight and went inside and opened my notebook and wrote down everything, and then I sat very still at the kitchen table for a long time because the shape of it was becoming clear, and the shape of it was much larger than I had understood. There is a particular kind of cold that has nothing to do with temperature. It is the cold you feel when you understand that something you thought was accidental was not accidental at all, and that the evidence has been sitting in front of you the whole time, waiting for you to look at it directly. I submitted my subject access request on a Monday morning. Under data protection law, any organization that holds personal data about you is required to provide it within 30 days, and I had learned during 9 years in a professional environment that the most useful thing you can do when a system has been used against you is to use the same system back. I sent the request to the firm's data controller and to the HR department separately, and I sent a second request to the email platform provider for metadata records on all correspondence sent from or to my work account in the previous 18 months, and then I sat down and waited. And while I waited, I kept building the timeline in my notebook because the timeline was the only thing I fully controlled. The firm responded in 11 days, which was faster than I expected. And I sat at the kitchen table on a Wednesday evening after Marin was asleep, and I went through the documents slowly and carefully. The way you go through structural drawings looking for the discrepancy that explains why something that should be standing is not standing, and it took me about 40 minutes to find the first one. There were 6 emails in the HR file that had been submitted as evidence of my erratic behavior, and they were presented as messages I had sent to Declan from my personal account during working hours, which was being framed as evidence that I was emotionally dysregulated and unable to maintain professional boundaries during the working day. I read the first one and I recognized the general shape of it because I had written something like it, but the specific words were not quite right and the tone was not quite mine. And there was a sentence in the third paragraph that I would not have written because it described a feeling I had never had in those terms. And I sat with that for a while before I moved on to the second email and found the same thing. And by the time I reached the fourth email, I had stopped looking for the differences and started looking for the structure underneath them because the structure was what mattered. Someone had taken real emails and edited them. Not dramatically, not in a way that would be obvious to someone who didn't know my voice, but carefully and specifically in the places where the original language was too ordinary to support the narrative that was being built around it. They had been adjusted to be just alarming enough to raise a concern and just plausible enough to survive a casual review, and whoever had done it had understood that HR departments are not literary critics and do not read for tone, they read for flags, and these emails had been written to flag. I wrote the word edited in my notebook and I drew a box around it, and then I wrote the word metadata next to it, and I underlined it twice because I needed to check the send dates against the metadata from the platform provider's response, and I needed to do that before I let myself think about what I was already thinking. The metadata response came 4 days later, and I opened it at the kitchen table at 11 at night, while the house was quiet and Marin was asleep upstairs, and the only sound was the central heating ticking in the walls. And I went through the timestamps line by line. And what I found was that 4 of the 6 emails in the HR file had metadata showing they had been accessed and modified between 12 and 18 days after their original send dates, and the modifications had been made from a device that was not my phone and not my work laptop, and the IP address associated with the modifications resolved to a location I recognized immediately because I had lived there for 4 years. I put my pen down. I did not pick it up again for several minutes. When I did, I wrote the date, and I wrote the IP address, and I wrote the word home. And then I sat back and looked at the ceiling, and I thought about the family weekend 3 months earlier when Declan had asked me to dictate a voice message while he drove because his hands were on the wheel, and he said it was easier if I just said the words out loud and he would sort the rest. I had thought nothing of it at the time. We had been doing small practical things for each other for years, and it had felt like one of those. But I had noticed that he asked me to repeat one sentence twice, and that he had not seemed to be looking at the road when he asked, and I had filed that noticing away in the place where you file things that don't yet have a category. I wrote voice recording in my notebook, and I wrote the date of the weekend, and I drew a line connecting it to the letter sent to Dr. Marsh, and I drew another line connecting both of them to the edited emails, and then I looked at what I had drawn, and what I had drawn was not a series of separate incidents. It was a sequence. It had a beginning and a logic and a direction, and the direction it was moving in had a name. I called Sadie Okonkwo the next morning. Sadie was a family law solicitor who had been recommended to me by a colleague at a firm I had worked with on a commercial project 2 years earlier, and I had saved her number at the time for no reason I could have explained except that it felt like the kind of number worth having. I told her I needed an appointment as soon as possible and that I had documentation and that I believed my husband had been building a case against me for at least 14 months and possibly longer. She saw me 2 days later, and I sat across from her desk and I put the notebook on the table and I walked her through everything in order, and she listened without interrupting, which I respected, and when I finished she looked at the notebook for a moment and then she looked at me and she said, "There is something you need to know." And she told me that 4 months ago a preliminary custody application had been filed with the family court, and the applicant was Declan, and the application had been filed not in response to any separation or dispute, but 4 months before either of those things had formally begun. He had not reacted to the marriage ending. He had planned for it. There is a difference between suspecting something and having it handed to you in a manila folder on a Tuesday afternoon, and the difference is not relief, and it is not satisfaction, and it is not the thing people imagine when they picture the moment the truth finally arrives. It is something quieter and heavier than any of those things, and it sits in your chest in a way that takes a long time to move. Sadie had filed our response to the custody application and initiated the discovery process, and Declan's solicitor Horst Brennan had been corresponding with her office in the way that solicitors correspond with each other, which is to say formally and carefully and with the specific courtesy that exists between professionals who are trying to dismantle each other's cases without appearing to be doing so. I had never met Brennan, but I had formed a picture of him from his letters, which were precise and unhurried. And I understood from Sadie that he had a reputation for being methodical, which meant that what happened next was not the kind of mistake a man like that was supposed to make. The document package arrived on a Tuesday, and it contained the standard materials we had been expecting, which were financial disclosure forms and a preliminary parenting statement, and a schedule of proposed contact arrangements. And Sadie's assistant logged them into the case file in the usual way, and it was only when Sadie sat down to review the package that evening that she found the folder that should not have been there, and she called me at 8:30 that night, and she said, "I need you to come in tomorrow morning, and I need you to be prepared for what you are going to read." I arrived at her office at 9, and she had the folder open on the desk, and she turned it toward me without saying anything, and I sat down and began to read, and what I read was a series of emails between Declan and his brother Griffin, spanning 14 months, and they were not legal correspondence, and they were not written in the careful language of a man who expected anyone else to ever see them. And that was the first thing I noticed, which was that the language was plain and direct in the way that people are plain and direct when they believe they are in private. The earliest email in the sequence was from Griffin, and it was a response to something Declan had apparently said in a conversation before the written exchange began. And Griffin was asking how serious Declan was and whether he had thought through what this would mean for Marin, and Declan's response to that was 3 sentences long, and the third sentence was the one I read twice, and then a third time while Sadie watched me from across the desk. And that sentence said that Marin was exactly the point, and that the simplest way to ensure the outcome he wanted was to make sure that by the time anyone looked at the situation clearly, The version of events that was already on record was the only version that had any documentation behind it. I kept reading, and as I read, I understood that the conversation I was looking at had not been the beginning of a plan, but the continuation of one. And that by the time Griffin had asked how serious Declan was, the answer was already operational because 3 weeks before that first email, Declan had already made contact with the custody evaluator and had already sent the letter to Dr. Marsh and had already begun the process of submitting the modified emails to the HR portal. And all of Griffin's questions in the months that followed were not the questions of someone helping to build something, but the questions of someone trying to keep pace with something that was already being built. There was one exchange near the middle of the sequence where Griffin asked if Declan was certain he wanted to go all the way. And Declan's answer was 2 words, and those 2 words were everything, and I wrote them in my notebook, not because I needed to remember them, but because writing things down is the only way I know how to make them real enough to act on. I looked up at Sadie, and she looked back at me, and neither of us said anything for a moment, and then she said she had already contacted the court to flag the disclosure and had begun the process of formally entering the folder into evidence. And I nodded, and I looked back at the emails, and I thought about 14 months, and I thought about every evening I had spent wondering if I was the problem. And I thought about Margaret at number 14 saying Declan had seemed very worried, and I felt something move through me that was not anger exactly, but was in the same territory as anger, and I let it move through, and then I picked up my pen. 12 days later, Sadie called to tell me that Horst Brennan had withdrawn from the case. He had filed the withdrawal notice with the court on a Thursday morning and had given no reason beyond a standard professional conflict declaration. And Sadie said that solicitors do not walk away from paying cases in active proceedings without a reason, and that the reason in a situation like this one was usually that they had learned something that made continued representation untenable. And she said she expected we would not hear from Brennan again, and she was right about that. But she was wrong about not hearing from his office, because 4 days after the withdrawal, I received a voicemail on my mobile from a number I did not recognize. And the voice was a woman's voice, and she did not give her name, and she spoke quickly and quietly in the way that people speak when they are using a window of time that might close at any moment. She said she was sorry to contact me this way and that she could not say more than she was about to say, and what she said was this: look at the metadata on the modified emails and look specifically at the device identifier in the access logs, and then look at whether that identifier appears anywhere else in the disclosure materials. Because if it does, then what you have is not circumstantial, and what you have is a chain. And a chain is something a court can follow from one end to the other without losing the thread. And then she stopped, and the line was quiet for a moment, and she said good luck, and she hung up. I played the voicemail 3 times, and then I opened my notebook, and I wrote device identifier at the top of a clean page, and I drew a line down the center, and on one side I wrote what I had, and on the other side I wrote what I still needed. And then I called Sadie, and I told her I needed a digital forensics analyst, and I needed one as soon as possible because I had just been handed the last piece, and I knew exactly where it fit. There is a kind of work that looks like stillness from the outside, and from the inside feels like the most deliberate and exacting thing you have ever done. And for 3 weeks in November, that was the only kind of work I did. And I did it the way I have always done the work that matters most to me, which is without rushing and without emotion. And with the complete understanding that the quality of what you build in the preparation stage determines everything that happens when the structure is finally placed under pressure. Kwame Asante had been recommended by Sadie as the most rigorous digital forensics analyst she had worked with in 15 years of family law practice. And when I met him in her conference room on the first Monday of those 3 weeks, he was younger than I had expected and considerably quieter. And he had a way of looking at a screen that reminded me of the way the best architects look at a set of structural drawings, which is not casually and not quickly, but with the focused and unhurried attention of someone who already knows that what they are looking for is present somewhere in the document, and that the only remaining question is exactly where it is sitting and what it is connected to. I gave him everything I had, which was the metadata response from the platform provider and the original emails and the modified versions from the HR file and the device identifier the paralegal had told me to locate. And I also gave him the anonymous letter sent to Dr. Marsh and the webmail account details Sadie had managed to trace through the postal and digital records. And he took all of it without comment and spread it across the table in front of him and looked at it for a long time without speaking. And then he said he needed 10 days. And he said he needed me to understand one thing clearly before he began, which was that what he was building was not an argument, but a record, and that the distinction mattered enormously, because an argument can be challenged and reframed and picked apart at the edges. But a record simply sits there and states what is true and invites anyone who disagrees to produce something that contradicts it. And in his experience, nothing had ever contradicted a record that had been built correctly. He came back in 8 days. The device identifier in the access logs for the 4 modified emails appeared in 3 separate locations across the full disclosure package, and all 3 of those locations were connected to documents associated with Griffin and specifically to 2 professional reference letters Griffin had submitted on Declan's behalf as part of the custody application. And those letters had been composed on the same machine that had accessed and modified my personal emails, and the formatting fingerprint embedded in the document. Metadata was not similar to the fingerprint in the modified files, but identical to it in the way that 2 things are identical when they come from the same source, and Kwame had mapped the entire chain in his report in language that was technical and precise and completely without interpretation, because he had built it as a record, and a record does not editorialize, and it does not need to, because the facts, when they are arranged in the correct order, speak with a clarity that no commentary can improve upon. The anonymous letter to Dr. Marsh had been sent from a webmail account that had been created using a browser on a device registered to a network associated with Griffin's home address. And the account had been accessed on 2 occasions, both of which fell within the same 14-month window as the email modifications, and the postal metadata placed the physical letter at a sorting office within 2 miles of Griffin's workplace. And Kwame had documented each of these data points separately, and then connected them in a sequence that was linear and unambiguous, and that answered every question a reasonable person could raise before that person had finished raising it. And I sat in Sadie's conference room looking at the completed files spread across the conference table, and I understood that 3 weeks of careful and unglamorous work had produced something that was more powerful than any confrontation I could have had, and more durable than any argument I could have made, because it was not mine, and it was not Sadie's, and it was not Kwame's, and it belonged to no one, which meant it could not be dismissed as partial or motivated or emotionally driven, because it was simply what had happened recorded in the order that it had happened by a machine that had no stake in the outcome. Sadie submitted the forensic report to the family court and to the firm's legal team on a Thursday morning, and by the following Tuesday I had a call from the managing partner, whose name I will not use here, but who called me himself, rather than delegating the call, which told me that the legal team had advised him to be direct, and he used the word reinstated 3 times, and the phrase full, back pay twice, and the word sorry once, and that once was brief and was placed inside a longer sentence about the firm's commitment to due process in a way that softened it considerably, but I accepted it because what I wanted was not an apology in the fullest sense of the word, but a correction. And a correction was what I was receiving, and I thanked him, and I ended the call, and I wrote reinstated in my notebook in plain letters, without underlining it, and without any other annotation, because it did not require celebration, and it did not require comment, and it simply needed to be recorded. Dr. Patricia Vane, the family court evaluator, filed a formal addendum to her report in the same week, and the addendum stated that she had been contacted by Declan prior to the official initiation of proceedings, and that this contact had not been disclosed to the court, and that it represented a procedural irregularity requiring judicial attention. And I read the addendum twice, and I thought about the fact that Declan had approached the evaluator before he had told me the marriage was in difficulty, and I thought about what that meant in terms of the sequence of events. And the sequence of events meant that the conversation we had eventually had about separating had not been a decision, but a stage direction. And that by the time we sat across from each other in the kitchen, and he said that things had not been working for a long time. The paperwork was already in motion, and the evaluator had already been primed, and the emails had already been modified, and the letter to Dr. Marsh had already been sent, and I had been the only person in that kitchen who did not know what the conversation was actually for. It was on a Friday evening while I was reviewing the final version of the master file that Priya called, and her voice when I answered was the voice of someone who has been carrying something heavy for long enough that they have stopped being able to hold it steady, and she told me she was sorry, and she said it several times, and she told me that she had received a text from my number months earlier saying that I had been struggling in ways nobody around me understood, and that she had believed it because it had come from my number, and because Declan had spoken to her the week before and had been so measured and so genuinely concerned, and she had not known, and I told her that I knew she had not known, and I told her I did not blame her. And both of those things were completely true, and I meant them without reservation, and she was crying by the end of the call, and I was not, because I had done my grieving earlier and quietly, and in the pages of a notebook that no one else had read. And by the time Priya called, I was no longer in the place where tears lived, and I was standing instead at the edge of the last remaining thing, looking at it without flinching and understanding that I was ready, and that the file was complete, and that what came next was not investigation and not reconstruction, but simply the truth walking into a room and sitting down and waiting to be read. The courtroom was smaller than I had imagined and quieter than I expected, and I want to tell you that I felt something dramatic when I walked in. But the truth is that I felt very little except a kind of settled clarity that I had not experienced in a long time, which was the clarity that comes not from certainty about the outcome, but from certainty about the preparation. And I had spent enough years in architecture to know that the feeling you want before a structure is tested is not hope and not confidence, but the specific and grounded knowledge that you have not left anything out. Declan arrived with his new solicitor, a woman named Claire Fenton, who had taken the case after Brennan withdrew, and who I could tell within the first few minutes of the proceedings had not been given the full picture of what she was walking into. And I did not feel anything particular about that, except a distant recognition that this was one of the consequences of building a plan on a foundation that could not survive scrutiny, which is that eventually the plan requires you to keep information from the very people whose job it is to help you. And at some point, those people walk into a room and find out what they were not told, and the discovery happens in public and in real time, and there is nothing that can be done about it at that stage, except to sit very still and try to look as though you knew. Sadie presented the record in 4 sections, and she did it without theater and without emphasis, because the material did not require either of those things, and the first section covered the timeline of the modified emails, and Kwame's forensic report, and the device identifier, and the formatting fingerprint connecting the modifications to Griffin's machine, and I watched the judge read the summary document, and I watched his expression, which did not change dramatically, but which shifted in a way I recognized, which was the shift that happens on a person's face when they have been presented with something that requires them to recalibrate what they thought they were looking at. The second section covered the anonymous letter to Dr. Marsh and the webmail account and the postal metadata and the network registration. And by the time Sadie moved to the third section, which was the welfare check document bearing the digital approximation of my signature, Claire Fenton had stopped writing notes and was sitting with her pen resting on the pad in front of her and looking at the documents with the expression of someone doing a very rapid and very private calculation about the situation they currently find themselves in. The third section also included the formal addendum from Dr. Vane, noting that Declan had contacted her before proceedings began, and the judge asked one question during this section, and the question was direct. And Sadie answered it directly. And after that, the room was quiet. In the way that rooms are quiet when the people in them have understood something and are processing what it means. The fourth section was the emails between Declan and Griffin, and Sadie read 2 passages aloud, and she read them in the same measured tone she had used for everything else. And the passages did not need her to read them with any particular feeling, because the feeling was already in the words themselves, which were the words of 2 men who had believed they were in private and had written accordingly. And when she finished reading the second passage, I did not look at Declan, because I did not need to, and because what was happening in that room was not about him anymore. In the way that the collapse of a poorly built structure is not really about the structure once the investigation has begun, but about the record of how it was built and why it failed. The judge delivered the ruling at the end of the session, and it was precise and unambiguous, and it awarded primary residency of Marin to me, and it ordered supervised contact for Declan, subject to the completion of a mandatory psychological assessment. And it noted in formal language that the court took an extremely serious view of the procedural irregularities identified in the evidence, and that the matter of the pre-proceedings contact with the evaluator would be referred for further review. And the judge used the word systematic once, and he used it carefully and in context, and it landed in the room the way a word lands when it has been chosen, with full awareness of its weight. I did not react when the ruling was read, and I did not look across the room, and I gathered my documents, and I thanked Sadie quietly, and I walked out into the corridor, and then out through the main doors into the car park, where the November air was cold and flat, and the sky was the particular gray of a day that has no intention of becoming anything other than what it already is. Declan was standing near the entrance, and he looked at me as I came through the doors, and I could see that he had prepared something, which is to say that his face had the arrangement of a person who has decided in advance what expression to wear and what words to lead with. And I looked back at him for a moment, and then I kept walking, because there was nothing that needed to be said between us that had not already been said in documents, and because the version of me that would have stopped and waited for those words to arrive had been replaced by a version that understood that the most powerful thing you can do when someone has spent 14 months trying to write your story for you is to simply and completely refuse to give them the final line. I kept walking, and I did not look back. 6 months later, I am sitting at a desk that faces the window, and the light in the mornings is the kind of light that makes the city look deliberate. And the project on my screen is the largest I have been given at the firm, and Marin is 7 years old now. And last Saturday, she asked me how buildings are designed, and I took her to a construction site, and she stood at the hoarding and looked through the gap at the steel framework rising from the ground, and she asked me what stops it from falling. And I told her that the foundation goes much deeper than it looks, and that most of what holds a building up is the part you cannot see. And she thought about that for a moment, and then she asked if we could get lunch, and I said yes, and we walked down the street together in the autumn light, and I held her hand, and I did not think about Declan, and I did not think about the courtroom, and I thought only about the weight of her hand in mine, and the sound of her voice asking ordinary questions, and the particular feeling of a life that is being lived going forward rather than defended going backward. I have thought a great deal about what the last 2 years taught me, and the thing I keep returning to is this, which is that the truth does not protect itself, and it does not announce itself, and it does not arrive without being sent for. And the people who understand this, and who respond to it not with noise, but with documentation, and not with reaction, but with record, are the people who are still standing when everything else has been tested and found to be built on something that was never solid to begin with. Facts are the only foundation that does not move. Everything I had, I wrote down, and everything I wrote down, I proved, and everything I proved, I presented, and that is the whole of it, and that is enough. If this story reached you somewhere real, then leave a comment below and tell me what part stayed with you. Because I read every single one, and your words matter more than you know. And if you are watching this and you have not yet subscribed, then please do it now. Because there are more stories coming, and every single one of them is about someone who refused to let the record be written without them. And if you found value in this today, then a like takes 2 seconds, and it helps this channel reach the person who needs to hear this next. And I will see you in the next story.